Hey there. Um, are you free to, exchange audio with me? Uh, I have a question about some things you've elaborated on before, like involving like the pagan gods. Like Thor. There's that meme you put up with Thor, or like Thor converted, bro. I have a question about that, if you mind. So, um, there is a question about theology regarding the Old Testament after God scattered the nations and divided them up and gave them land and gods according to their number and all that. My question is, of course, um, were these gods evil? Like, I mean, I've seen some videos say that God doesn't have demons in his ploy. They didn't start off as demons. They started off as good spirits, but then because God gave them this power and responsibility to govern these nations well, they allowed themselves to be corrupted. They accepted idolatry. And I accept that to be true, but my question is, what do you think it could have looked like then? Where, let's say, these gods, these pagan gods, did not turn evil. They did not turn to idolatry. Because to me, like, how can you be in the position of a lowercase g God and govern a nation, but yet not actually be worshipped by these people? How could that work? I guess is my question. It's kind of complicated. If you don't understand what I mean, I guess I can elaborate a little more, but this is just the best way I can say it right now.
So for most of these questions, um, there are multiple interpretations. I don't claim to really have an answer. The Thor converted bro thing is a bit of a joke, because there's a minority opinion that Thor and Odin and such, they were like probably warriors in the third or fourth century. But at the same time, the deities and specifically mentioned show up in Roman records, but under different names. And the German religion is a bit unclear if they believed in a reincarnation cycle, or there's a lot of muddiness because they did have gods the Romans recorded, but they had different names like Tyre instead of Thor, and of course what Wotan or something, I forget, for Odin, but these names change over time. Um, and if you're thinking from a Christian perspective, if this is like 200 BC when the Romans are documenting them, it would have been, you know, over 2,000 years since the flood. So, um, that's one thing. I'm gonna have another voice thing. I'm gonna do a second for. And so the general understanding is that when Noah and his family left the ark, and the brothers had their little kerfuffle over the wine and Noah being drunk, at some point they decided to divide the world. Now it's unclear when they decided to divide the world, if this was before or after the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel should have been close enough to the flood that, Japheth and Shem would have still been alive. Um, but it's you don't see. You have to kind of like look at this with Christian glasses at pagan mythology, and so from that perspective, Japheth appears to die fairly soon after the ark, because in Greek mythology, Zeus, the I think the nephew or cousin, either a nephew or grandnephew of Iapeth, the Titan who has the same name as Japheth. Um, Zeus kills him in the Great Titanomachy, the Titan Wars, the wars between the Olympians and the Titans. And so that war in particular indicates that Zeus slaughtered most of the first generation out of the ark, outright slaughtered them all. in a bid for power to rule the West. Now, at that point, during the Titanomachy, the world would have already been divided because the peoples are already occupying their territory. And so the question becomes, where's the Tower of Babel there? It's before the Titanomachy, it's after the flood, and that time span is like, 1,200 years. So you have a large wiggle room, and it's worth thinking about. Now, in simple, I tend to view I tend to think that the world was divided after the Tower of Babel, and if you follow the logic that it was Nimrod who founded the tower, which is not necessarily clear. It's just the traditional understanding that Nimrod built the tower, and he was called a the word that they use implies he was a slave master. Nimrod, you can imagine, he's like the grandson or son of Ham. He's like this like dark skinned fella in the Middle East, in the Levant, and he's established the first empire. He's the first king of the earth, if you will, and he builds this great tower to challenge God or heaven. Traditions indicate Nimrod would have had, like, he tended to worship the forces of nature as gods rather than like explicit personified gods. So he worshipped, like, I think he worshipped fire, like the spirit of fire, if you will. And Nimrod was he would have been essentially enslaving all the sons of Noah for his empire. And it's not clear whether or not the dividing of the earth came before or after this, but it seems like it was probably after, because they scattered after the tower was canceled. So you can imagine, you're a few decades after the flood. A tower has been maybe a century after the flood. No one's really quite sure. And so all the sons of Noah, most of them have failed to have failed to fulfill God's order to fill the earth. However, the Bible does say that Javan and Canaan went out. Javan willingly, Canaan unwillingly. It's also unclear if Canaan going out is because later it's talking about Israel kicking them out later on, or if this was during the flood generation. It's not clear. A lot of ambiguity here. So you have a situation where the Bible in Genesis 9 says that Javan built a ship for him and his sons and went out, and they had their own languages. It may be worth thinking that this happened after the Babel, when God created languages. But here's the thing. So Javan heading out west, giving the land to his sons based off their languages, and it only mentions him doing this with his languages. None of the other 70 grandsons and so forth of Noah, it says this. So it kind of implies that Javan might have created his own language before the Tower of Babel, and that the Genesis 10 saying everybody spoke one language, it can still be true, because Javan would have still been able to speak the universal language, but he would have already been creating his own languages, and Javan would have been essentially the only loyal offspring of Noah who was actually following God's command to go out and fill the world. And so the theory is that Javan departs for the west before the Tower of Babel is built, and then Nimrod essentially starts enslaving everyone who hasn't left the Valley of Shinar, which is that's the Fertile Crescent, Shinar. Shinar might mean, well, I think, yeah, Shinar means Sumer, so this is like the Sumerian civilization, essentially. And so you have Nimrod enslaving everyone while Javan is out west. And so you might wonder, perhaps Nimrod's downfall was at the hands of Javan. It's not clear, but this conflict between Javan going west to Greece and Nimrod ruling in the east, it somewhat sounds like the Titanomachy, right? It sounds like this is the setup for the Titanomachy, where the gods of Olympus in Greece are getting ready to fight the gods of the Titans in the east. Now the question would be, Javan is the son of Japheth in Christian mythology, and Zeus is the nephew of Japheth in Greek mythology. So it kind of sounds like Zeus might have been a son of Javan, not clear, but Ion. Javan means Ion, the Ionians, and Achaeans. It sounds very similar to Achaiawans, which is the brothers of Javan. So it's very ambiguous what's going on there. But essentially, you have a situation where you have the only independent power in Greece versus the entire East under Nimrod, and bada bing, bada boom. God confuses Nimrod and breaks this global empire up, and then the people start scattering after that. Now, the reason why I'm emphasizing this is because of the prophecy Noah said, where Japheth would occupy the tents of Shem, which indicates that Japheth is somewhat destined for greatness to some degree, and to that degree, you could view Javan creating his own language before Babel as indicating Greek would be the only language that isn't a curse, thus fulfilling the prophecy that Greek would replace Hebrew in God's tent, as the Christian church fulfilled. You would then think Greek is being given a special liturgical value here because it's the only language that isn't a curse from God, which kind of makes sense if Javan was the only faithful, obedient person to God's call to go and fill the world. Ergo, if he's leaving the Tower of Babel before it's built and he's following God's command, of course his language would be holy. And of course it makes sense that it would be the first Christian language when Christ came. This all kind of fits a nice piece of pie amidst the ambiguity. So in that regard, you would have Javan and his family being essentially the only loyal Christians, independent Christians, along with Shem in Nimrod's empire, probably either a slave or a servant. And that's about it. That's the Christian church during the Tower of Babel days. It's basically just the Greeks and the Hebrews. And in that regard, you would then view Zeus and others as they beat the Titans and the Titanmaki, and they become the new gods in town, and perhaps that's when power goes to their heads. When this is implying that Zeus and others are humans, that they're not actually like angels or anything. They're just humans who beat the other humans and received glory for defeating this grand empire of Nimrod. So they were deified by their followers essentially. In terms of actual spiritual beings and fallen beings, this goes into the idea of thrones and dominions in the Bible, which are regarded as living. It's important to remember that there are angels and then there are thrones and dominions, and all three of these are eternal beings created by God, and they kind of exist behind the scenes of worldly powers. You can remember when Daniel is praying for God to help him, and the angel comes and says, I was contesting with the prince of Persia, and it's implied that this angel was fighting the spiritual prince of Persia, not the physical prince, the man, the angel or spirit behind the throne. And this is repeated elsewhere in the Bible, where I forget where it is in Ezekiel or Isaiah, I can never remember, but it's say to the prince and say to the king, and it's implied it's not the same person. It's one's a spirit, one's a human king, and so in that regard, there's always a physical and a spiritual aspect behind any throne or dominion or kingship, right? There's the man who sits on the throne, and then there's the throne that possesses him when he sits on it. And it doesn't matter what man sits on the throne, there's this spirit behind the throne that will possess the man across generations. And it's this spirit behind the throne that is fallen. That's the fallen angel, not the figure with a name and a lineage, right? He's just becoming a vessel for the throne. And this is a very ancient idea where the king is essentially becoming the body of a deity or spirit behind the power. Um, Thus, when he gives the throne to his son, in a certain way, the divinity of the throne continues through a new body. It's a kind of like a possession idea that it shows up in the Bible. It shows up in Pharaoh. It's, sometimes you have like, a dozen kings with the same name because they're implying that it's the same persona behind the different men. It's the same spirit. Like, Ptolemy 1 through 7 or whatever, how many Ptolemies there were ruling Egypt. They're all the same Ptolemy. They're under the same spirit. And so, in terms of fallen angels, that would be the fallen angels. It's the throne itself, the spirit behind the throne is the fallen angel. And so in Genesis 9 and 10, when the sons of Noah divide the world amongst each other, what they're really doing is they are creating dominions for spirit, fallen or not, to rule over them as a collective people. And the person who sits on the throne doesn't actually matter. It's the spirit behind it. This shows up in some Psalms where, and I think Proverbs and Isaiah, where it's like, God has confounded the court of his so and so. I forget the verse, and you'll have to look this up. Miser, the Bible translator, Meiser, I think, Michael Miser. I forget his name, but he's a Bible translator. He's done a lot of good work, like understanding this, and so you can kind of also look at this in terms of where did Paul go to preach? Why was Paul so obsessed with getting to Spain? Because if you look at the nations Paul went to preach, he's going down the list in Genesis 9 and 10 of the sons of Japheth. He's like, he's in Europe. He's going to go to the sons of Japheth. And he goes down the list of named sons one by one. And the last one is Tarshish, and that's all the way out in Spain. So he's obsessed with getting to Spain because he feels that he must reclaim these thrones for Christ from the fallen angels behind the throne. He must redeem every son of Japheth. He feels it's his moral duty to do so. And so he's convinced that he's not going to be martyred until he's preached to every son of Japheth. And this shows up in terms of where he goes to preach in the West. And yeah, after he's preached to every son of Japheth, he gets martyred in Rome. So that was his goal. If he felt like that was his duty. It's never outright said in the Bible, but if you're going in a linear fashion down that list in terms of where you're going to preach, it kind of implies that you're clearly undoing Babylon. Basically, you're going to these peoples that have been divided off, and you're exercising the demonic fallen spirit behind the throne and allowing the Holy Spirit and God's angels to occupy it instead, so that the lineages would be saved, essentially. So in that regard, to come around back, you can essentially view the entire Indo-European pantheon, which is a scholarship term for like the generally consistent gods from the Germans, the Indians, the Greeks, the Slavics. They're all kind of the same god, just with a different name. They kind of all have this similar ones. I think Perquonus, for example, is considered one and the same with like Perquonus is not a named god, but it's just the name that you find if you linguistically reconstruct it from the earlier sources of various Indo-European people, that this is, simultaneously Thor, Ares, Mars, whatever, I don't know. And the Bible kind of agrees with this idea. In Revelation 9:11, it says that Apollo is the angel of the void. Whether or not that means he's fallen or not, I can't really tell, but it kind of implies that the angel of death is the god Apollo in Greek mythology. Like he's known as Apollo or Apollyon, the way it spells it in Revelation, Apollyon. This is the Anatolian spelling of it. In Greece, it's just Apollo. And the Bible is basically saying, like, yeah, this guy you worship called Apollo, he's actually the angel of death. He's what's the Hebrew word? Agabedon. I forget what it is, but it's basically like the Bible does these things sometimes where it says like, yeah, these figures are all the same despite different cultures. They all come from the same root, and in that regard, yeah, Apollo wouldn't be a son of Noah. He would be an angelic figure, whether fallen or not, I don't know. And so that the ambiguity really comes in, like when you look at a pagan god, is it a fallen angel or is it a man? It's a bit of both. So like Apollo, for example, in Greek mythology is I think the doctor of the gods, and he's kind of like this like weird god that's like, how is it that the gods need a medicine man, right? Like they're gods, they should be able to be immortal, but like it's kind of implied that this Apollo figure is who is giving these men their immortal lives. And this is perhaps an explanation for the longer lives of men right, before and after, immediately after the flood. Their longer lives were coming from, spiritual beings maintaining their life. So Apollo is the primary angel who gave the sons of Japheth longer life, and this is why you can find the records of the tombs of Zeus and Dionysus and other gods. They had tombs in like Crete and elsewhere, but you can't really find a grave on the records for Apollo, and so it kind of all points to the fact that what Revelation 9:11 says, like this particular pagan god is actually an angel, um, and the rest of the gods were probably just his like who he was caretaking. The sons of Japheth he was caretaking, giving them larger life. And this particular idea is actually in Plato. Plato in Timaeus, he says that the gods were created essentially mortal, but that he can, God Almighty can grant them eternal life from his nature. And so this is like a Platonic way of understanding how is it that men used to live so long and now they don't. Well, once the angel falls, he kind of can't give the gift of life anymore. He's been separated from God. And so then of course the question becomes, well, why did God set these angels up to rule over these men in the first place, knowing that they would fall? And I think the point is that they would fall. And that's something worth thinking about, because these angels, these beings were, I suppose, originally good, and they had this nature about them where they wanted to take care of men and uplift them in their sin. And at some point, that crossed over into deification. Now, there are a few traditions, and it's difficult to say. It kind of sounds like God. The way the Bible describes it sounds like whoever wrote those lines was reading Plato, because Plato more or less says, the God in particular is responsible for the souls that he's subject to, and at some point in time, the high God is going to come for those souls, and if they were well taken care of, then the angel gets the reward, and his subjects get eternal life, and if not, then they all get cast into hell together. It's a bit of a strange dynamic, but this is basically what Plato says, and the Bible kind of sounds like that, where like in Psalms God says, like, I called you gods because you had my words, right? Like my words of eternal life. I gave you my words to give these people life, and you have like cursed them and caused confusion. You failed in your responsibilities. These people are starving, they're poor, they're miserable, they're murdering each other. This is all your fault, O angels who I put in charge. Worst of all, they worship you as gods now rather than my servants. And this is why the angels in the New Testament are so sensitive to not being bowed to, not being worshipped, because they're the angels that didn't fall into this vice that the fallen ones did. Now, when it comes to angels, there are a lot of questions, and are these beings? God is outside of space and time. Are angels also outside of space and time? Probably not, because if they can fall, it implies that they are subject to change over time, so they're within space. They are here with us. And elsewhere, the Son of Man was hidden in the Father. That this is a saying in Enoch, and I think it's somewhat echoed in the New Testament. I can't remember, but the idea that God hid Jesus from his own angels, that they would be shocked when he revealed his plan for salvation. It's to the confusion of angels, I believe Paul says. The angels don't understand it because it was hidden from them. So this all implies that angels are created within the universe. They're not subject to the external influence that God has power over the universe. That they are subject to its forces. And again, depending on what you're willing to go with, it does imply angels are like they're beings of light, but they're like subject to the forces of nature. So like if you threw God into a black hole, he would just like surprise, I teleported behind you. But if you threw an angel into a black hole, he'd actually get stuck in there, right? Like they're physical beings stuck in this universe. Perhaps they have flesh and blood. Perhaps they have but yet they're made of light. So it's implied that there's some kind of created being in this universe subject to it, and as such they can fall. They can and there is no salvation for them when they fall, unlike mankind who can be saved. And so when angels fall, they fall to the there's no doubt in their falling. There's no doubt that they're fallen because there's no opportunity for a resurrection. And so you would wonder, like, well, why would God make these beings that, like, they fail once, they're done? It's kind of an awful experience, but I would argue all the more why they are above us in creation, that they can maintain perfection for thousands and thousands of years, that they can achieve a degree of perfection that men confuse them for gods, and that the good angels remind them of the true God, and that the bad angels lie and say they are God. In Greek mythology, hold on, save the next one. In Greek mythology, there's always the implication of this higher god above the gods. Plato mentions it. He calls him Father God, like we Christians do. Hence why many Christians suspect that Plato might have been a prophet, because of how intimately he seemed to know God as we know him. Plato called God three kings who are one. So he seems to be somewhat of a Trinitarian. Plato seems to paraphrase Isaiah. He seems to be aware of certain biblical truths that he could not possibly have known alone in Greece, although he says that he learned it from reading the archives of Athens, which suggests there was always some small Christian community in the ancient pagan world, forgotten and unwritten about, and that Plato basically implies that the city states started corrupting the true religion and looking at the gods not as mere mortals but as gods. So there's a lot of backroom there, but in the you should read Timaeus, because it kind of explains the archaic Greek understanding of what we would identify as, like, the view of the world immediately after the flood. And in Timaeus, he does talk about a flood as well, and the survivors of that flood and how they survived, and et cetera, et cetera. It's a very good book for understanding, the last sunsetting of pre-pagan Greece. The Greeks immediately under Javan and his sons. Whether or not Javan stayed faithful to God, or Japheth, it's unclear if Javan and Japheth stayed faithful to God. It's very unclear, because in the Greek myths they are brutal people filled with rage and pride and killing each other. Zeus kills Iapit the Titan and takes his power, and he does all kinds of awful things. So they were deeply fallen men by the time of the Titanomachy. But to circle around, so there is there are figures in Norse mythology that are related to the general Indo-European pantheon, but the immediate stories of people like Thor and Odin seem to be based off of real people who lived sometime around like 200 BC to 400 AD, something like that. And my joke that Thor converted, bro, is basically the idea that by the time the Christians get there, they were already Aryans. So, they were heretical Christians, but when the Christians got to the Germans, they had already converted mostly. So it's unclear how, it's unclear who did it, but like, they were basically already converted. So the Christians had to do it more with correcting the Arian heresy than actually converting the Germans, who had, by and large, had already converted by the time they came into contact with the Romans. Other than the imperial, the various invasions before the contact with Christianity, blah 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 blah. You get what I'm saying? Um, so there is a greater likelihood that the physical real person who had the name Thor converted to Arian Christianity. It's actually quite likely. um, who knows? Who cares? It's just a funny joke to dab on pagans. But yes, that's the general. Yeah, so read Plato's Timaeus, Tiameus, I think. Read Socrates' opinion on these things. That's like getting the pagan perspective, and then you can kind of read through the Psalms. I would say read through Psalms, Ezekiel, and Isaiah to get the Christian perspective of these things, and then you can probably just read like um, Justin Martyr and others to get their opinions on these people. The church fathers wrote a lot about the idea. It's the general the idea that they were humans is called Ehemerism. I'll text it. I can't remember the guy's name, but he was a scholar in Greece who preached that the pagan gods were humans. He was laughed out of academia for it. This is like BC era. Everybody hated it. But the thing is, his evidence was pretty solid. Like, there's evidence that, well, even in pagan Greece, they constantly insult Crete, the island Crete, because they had tombs to the gods, implying that they had died. And this is a great offense to the mainlander Greeks. As to why, the Crete had a different branch of the Indo-Europeans when they invaded. Greece had like a pre-Indo-European population. They called it Dorian invasion, but there's no evidence for Dorian invasion. They just kind of like came in and like took over. And so some of them went to Crete, some of them went to Greece, some of them went to Anatolia, and they each kind of had their own ideas of religion. And so we're more familiar with the Greek mainland pagan gods, but that's only because they survived. The extinct beliefs among the Anatolians and the Cretans and the Rhodesians and all the other ones, they were different. The Cretans believed the gods died. The Anatolians built all kinds of weird shit to the gods. These were also Greeks who, well, they're not really Greeks, but like the Greek half breeds mixed in with the native population who constructed their own ideas. And mind you, they were older ideas. Because, as you well know, the Mycenaean civilization in Crete is older than the Doric and Ionian civilizations that came later in Anatolia and mainland Greece. And so, as these classical era civilizations and city-states rise out of the ashes of the Bronze Age and they start making trade routes and conversations with their neighbors, they discover that the religion they have in their city-states is younger than the religion of their neighbors in Crete and Anatolia, and that these older religions speak more about the death of the gods than their own. And so this would create a significant pain for them, because it would be like, imagine you're a Protestant and you visit Rome and you find this like prophetic text from like the 500s that intimately details the great heretic Luther who would rise in 1,000 years and destroy the church. What are you, as a Protestant, you are forced to deal with that information. And so the same thing with the Greeks, like the mainland Greeks, they come to Crete, they come to Anatolia, and they discover that the gods they believe in died in the history books of those older civilizations. So this created a significant mental gap between what they were taught and what they were finding in the wider world. Sorry, um, and the mainlander Greeks essentially just taught it. They dismissed it as like, oh, you silly Cretans, you're liars and all that. But the thing is, the Cretans are 1,000 year older civilization from the mainland Greeks, so like, you can't just dismiss that. Like, they're literally 1,000 years older than you. They worship the same gods, and they say that they died. What are you going to do with that information? You can't just ta it away. And in many ways, when the Christians came, they took advantage of this because obviously, if you're a Christian missionary trying to convince the Greeks that that their gods are either dead men or demons, hey, your neighbors say that, and they've been here for 1,000 years longer than you have. So Justin Martyr does this a lot in his writing, and essentially this, the elite and the noblemen and the scholars knew this in Greece, and they kind of taught it, but the common people didn't. They weren't tourists, and so once the Roman Empire allowed this kind of broader tourism and traveling, and the Greeks started discovering this truth, also the Romans did too. This destroyed their ideas of virtue and holiness. Like, it completely devastated them. And by the time of Jesus, that there was a rising feeling of doubt and what's the point, like nihilism within the Roman Empire, as they found these older belief systems. And ultimately the Christians just took advantage of it and pointed it out. It's like, I mean, look, what do you want me to say? My God's immortal. He just died and raised again, and your God is dead. There he is. There's his tomb in Crete. You can go and visit it right now. Pay the boatman, go visit it. There's his bones. There's the bones of Zeus. There he is, dead. And this completely destroyed their entire insular belief system that had been tucked away in pleasant city states for 1,000 years. And once exposed to the reality around them, that the religion died very quickly, and the Christians came in and replaced it. And this is also, of course, why Christianity sprang up so quickly in Anatolia, Syria, Crete, and elsewhere, because the people there already knew this about their gods, that they were dead men who had lived and died, and so Christianity just made sense to them. It took a little convincing for Greece. The last pagans died out in Greece in something like the 800s AD. They held out for a long time. But, Syria, Anatolia, they converted within decades after Jesus' death. So it was like, there's just no stopping it. Okay, that's it. That's my little lecture. I hope it was useful to you. And feel free to ask questions. I'll try to get to it. I'm kind of sleepy, but I still got an hour before I go to bed. Ta ta.